The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show, rational self-interest and individual rights.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Friday night. Not a usual time for us to do a show, but making up for the fact that I was traveling all week. Yaron Brook Show. All right, why do we have a
Friday night? Not a usual time for us to do a show, but making up for the fact that I was traveling.
All right, this has never happened before.
Why do we have a
Always fun.
Not a usual time for us to do a
What is
show,
going
but,
on? That is muted. That is muted. All right. 1, 2, 3. It's gone. That was weird. It went away. I didn't do anything. Okay. Anyway, welcome everybody on this Friday night. I am incredibly happy to have Elan Journo here with me. Elan is a senior fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. He specializes on applying Ayn Rand's philosophy to current events with a particular expertise in foreign policy, and in particular the Middle East, but broadly foreign policy. Elan also has the distinction of being one of the few people, maybe the only person still at the Institute who was there before I arrived. So yes, I think that's right. Donna, part-time, but I don't know anybody else. I don't think anybody else is there. So welcome, Elan.
Thank you, Ron. I'm pleased to be with you tonight.
Good. All right. So I don't know. You're a little soft. I don't know if it's just me. Say something again. Let me just check the.
Hi, is this any better for you? Is this
It's a little soft. Let me see if I can increase the volume here. I'm worried about them. Can you guys on the chat maybe tell me if Elan is too soft? Or I've raised his volume, so hopefully.
How's this? Let us know if it's not loud enough, and I can also speak more.
Ian says fine for us. All right, cool.
All right.
All right, so I thought we'd start a discussion maybe with broader kind of perspective. There was a time in the 90s, and then maybe 10, 12, 13 years ago, when the sense was, certainly in the 90s, there was a sense was foreign policy doesn't matter anymore. Soviet Union's gone. America has no enemies in the world. Foreign policy is finished. It's dead. We then got 9/11. We screwed that up, and various people have different views on why we screwed it up. We have a particular view. Others don't agree with us, but generally, okay, well, there's the Islamic threat, but we're strong, we're powerful, we can overcome that. But other than that, it seemed like a pretty boring world. And it seems like the last 2-3 years, that has changed dramatically. I mean, do you have that sense that something has changed significantly? And do you have any thoughts about why and what's going on in the world?
Yeah, I would differentiate between the reality and how people process it. I think the reality is foreign policy was always important. It wasn't something that was given the attention it needed until there was a crisis. And when you get a crisis, everyone's on top of it. This was the best example of this was Bush, who ran Bush Jr., so George W. Bush. People might not remember because he's so associated with 9/11. He ran as someone who's not interested in foreign policy. He was very much in the kind of leave us alone, we'll leave you alone camp. And then 9/11 happened, and that became the defining issue in his career. So I think the reality is that the threats were mounting for many decades pre 9/11, and it's not as if, and take Russia as another one. So it was Bush who stared into the eyes of Vladimir Putin and saw his soul and believed he found someone he could trust. And 20 years later, all of that it didn't take 20 years to discover that was BS, but it was there for anyone to see that this was a mounting problem. And I think similar things could be said about China, but I think the reality is that there was always lots to think about and lots to deal with. I think it's a symptom of the way our political scene works, which is that it's very concrete bound. It's what Ayn Rand called the anti-conceptual mentality. It goes along with pragmatism, which I know is a theme you talk about a lot. And in my view, is the trend of thinking of foreign policy as not mattering until it's a crisis is a self-reinforcing pattern. So the more you ignore it, the more it's a crisis, and then you have to deal with it as a crisis. Now, you ask about the last few years. I think maybe there's a heightening of attention precisely because of who's seen a land war in Europe on this scale for, since World War II, and all the worries about Putin and all the concerns prior to that were realized. And he is as brutal and maybe more brutal than people imagined. And he's willing to cross borders again and again. So there's a whole history of doing that. I want to pick up on something you raised, because something else, which is this idea that you didn't put it in these terms just since we started, but this is the way it was seen, as like history's ended. And then, the liberal democracy has been established. There's no other competitor to it. And I think that lulled people into a sense of complacency. Now, that argument is associated with Francis Fukuyama, who is, in my view, a disappointing human being, not just a disappointing intellectual. I've read a couple of his works, and I read that article a number of times. And it's something you study in graduate school. You can't not read his work and think about the 20th century. And unfortunately, it is a really stupid argument as an argument. Now, there are interesting things he's talking about, which I think is the globalization is starting to reach a cusp where this is really a powerful force and on a scale we've never seen before. And there are important things about so-called liberal democracy that are being recognized. So if you think about the Thatcher Revolution, Reagan, it's in that milieu that he's writing. So there's important developments to think about. But what he does with that is rubbish. And it leads people to think, yeah, well, what else is there? Marxism is discredited, it's gone away. Maybe nationalism will be a thing, but yeah. And now what's left to do, as you put it, sort of boring. But that's completely not reality oriented. It's really not thinking about it.
So what's wrong with it, right? I mean, because there's something wrong about the conception of liberal democracy, basically a mixed economy, as some kind of end result. And Ayn Rand really emphasized that a mixed economy was not stable. It would never sustain itself. Yet he viewed it as kind of a end game, whereas Ayn Rand certainly viewed it as it is not sustainable over the long run.
Yeah, I don't think it's sustainable for a number of reasons. There are dynamics in the economic side of things that lead to more regulation and greater controls and sort of a whiplashing effect. There are also dynamics in the way people think. And so I think that one of the deeper insights that Ayn Rand has about the mixed economy is it creates a certain mentality and reinforces a certain mentality. One piece of it is a tribal way of thinking, because it fractures society into competing groups and everyone wants a piece of the so-called fixed pie. And that's just not reality, but that's how people behave. And it fosters pressure group warfare. And we see that it's everywhere. Now it's just taken for granted that there's lobbies and pressures. The other kind of thing that it fosters cognitively is a very short-term mentality. And so if you think about the intellectual currents in the 20th century of pragmatism and this rebellion against principles, the mixed economy reinforces that, because realistically, how far can you think? How far can you plan? And you have to deal with all sorts of crises. And I think there's an interesting issue where it brings people into political office and into positions of power where their success is based on not thinking long-term and sort of navigating these constant crises. And that ties into the issue of foreign policy as well, because it's the way you think about it. You're not really evaluating what's happening on the scene. You're looking dot to dot, not seeing the whole pattern. So I think there's a lot that makes it unstable politically, economically, and then with respect to foreign policy. If your view is there's no principles, there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, and it's, we'll cut a deal with anybody because that's what you do domestically. Well, what does that look like internationally when you deal with people who are crooks and criminals and gangsters and thugs and dictators? If your attitude to them is the same as it is with your people across the aisle, so to speak, we can cut a deal with anybody. We can log roll. We can, okay, if you think that applies internationally with people who want to kill you, okay, that's going to be a recipe for real conflict down the road. If you look at Putin and you think, yeah, he's just like the guy on the other side of the aisle. We can cut a deal for the budget with that guy. Well, why can't we cut a deal with Putin on, he wants a bit of Europe? Now, I think there's a lot there, but it's a kind of multi-factor trend where you have this mixed economy that pushes people into certain forms of behavior and reinforces them.
And yeah, so it's essentially a system of pragmatism, which ends nowhere, and it encourages the anti-conceptual mentality you talked about, and it leads towards short-term policies and weakness. It is interesting that every so many years, every time it's quiet a little bit, an American president comes around, or this so-called, we don't want to intervene in the world. We don't want to think about foreign policy. We don't want to do any of that. And that is always perceived as weakness. And that is always when they come after us. I don't think it's an accident. 9/11 happened when it did, given the weakness of the presidents before that, starting with Reagan, or starting with Jimmy Carter, really, with Iran. And of course, the weakness of, I think, Trump and Biden, which I think have emboldened both Putin and the Hamas. So what's your assessment of the stakes in Ukraine, and what is America's kind of, Justin asks in a question here, why should Americans care about Ukraine? What's in it for America?
Yeah, I mean, I think the basic issue is you're looking at Putin as a world actor, and it's important to understand that there's no reason to expect him to be satisfied if he wins in Ukraine, and that is a real threat, and that's a real problem with respect to our commitments to NATO countries. So Ukraine isn't yet in NATO, but there's real worries about what happens after Ukraine. So that's one issue. I think the second issue is, so I don't think, to put that a different way, you don't want to encourage someone like Putin. That's really harmful. He's destructive. And we've done a lot prior to Ukraine to embolden him. So there's a lot to say about that. There's an argument that I heard recently that I'm thinking about as more and more plausible, which is that one reason to support Ukraine, well, let me come to that in a minute. So the other reason to think about this from the US perspective is I think Ukraine is a country that has a lot of problems. It also is trying to move in the right direction. It's trying to move towards Western Europe. I think there's reason to think that they want to be a better country, more free. I don't think they're angels. I mean, there's a lot of problems with Ukraine, but they're worlds away from Russia. And in that context, I think morally you have to support the better side. And the better side in this case, I think, is unquestionably Ukraine. So there's that piece of it too. So I think there's important issues at stake. So you don't want Putin to win. You certainly don't want him to win in a contest with a better country. And I think there's a moral claim that Ukraine has to support from that side of things. But let me get to this argument that I heard recently that I'm still thinking about. So I'm not sure I'm convinced of this. But there's a kind of tactical issue that people offer as a reason to be more concerned with supporting Ukraine. And that is, if the Ukrainians are fighting against Putin and we offer them support, that weakens Putin at very low cost to the US. Now, I generally don't go into that kind of strategy thinking or tactical thinking, because there's a lot that goes into those sorts of things. And I don't know if it's that credible militarily. But the argument is you weaken Putin without actually having to confront him militarily. Ukraine does that and you support Ukraine. So in effect, it's a kind of proxy war, which it is already. I mean, the reality is Iran is supporting Russia and we're supporting Ukraine, and other bad regimes are supporting Putin. So I find that interesting as a perspective, but I wouldn't say it's the key issue for why we should care about Ukraine. I think the key issue is it's a better country than Russia. Russia is a horrible dictatorship that should lose.
Yeah, and we don't want to embolden Putin. You know, the reason he probably won't invade other countries in Europe is because he's having such a hard time in Ukraine. And the only reason he's having such a hard time in Ukraine is because they got Western weapons before the war, and they've gotten them since. And indeed, hopefully they'll be getting them soon again. I think the House of Representatives is actually going to vote on a Ukraine aid bill, and I think they're going to approve it. So I think the U.S. will be providing aid to Ukraine here soon. Any thoughts about the relationship between Russia and Iran? I mean, that's an interesting one. I mean, Russia's been supporting Iran for a long time. I think they helped them build still helping them build the nuclear power plant in Iran, and are one of the few countries that don't pay attention to the embargo or restrictions on trade with Iran. But on the other hand, Russia has a Muslim problem. It fought a whole war in Chechnya over a Muslim problem. It's supporting a Muslim country. Do you have any sense of what their thinking is there, and maybe they're as pragmatic as we are?
Yeah, I don't know if I would classify it as pragmatic. I think there's a kind of mentality that you find with dictators or authoritarian regimes it's sort of a gangster mentality, and it looks a lot like the pragmatist, but maybe in the end it is the same thing. And it's about power and convenience. And it might be that, yeah, they're Muslims and we have a Muslim problem in Chechnya, but in the end, it's more important to get the weapons from Iran. It's more important. Now, before we get deeper into this topic, I want to just flag that the Iran-Russia nexus goes back a long way, and it's important to note it. So throughout the early 2000s, Iran was in this back and forth with the United Nations, where periodically there'd be a resolution in the United Nations. I think the US would sponsor it, other nations would sponsor it. Iran, we want you to stop with this nuclear stuff, and you need to comply with these conditions. And the two countries that routinely blocked the resolutions, blocked enforcement, were China and Russia. And then, so this is through the early 2000s. Then you get the Syrian civil war, or Syrian collapse, or however you think of it, because it's really just a collapse at this point. And Russia is a major part of this conflict, along with Iran. So Iran's supporting the Assad regime, and Russia is supporting both of them. And again, you could ask the same question: why are they doing this? There's sort of Islamic regimes or nominally Islamic regimes. But in the end, I think Russia had a view about what it wants to do in that part of the world, and it had a view about Iran. Now, the wider point that I think is important to put this together, like the headline issue, is when you find authoritarian regimes and dictatorships and theocracies, when they're clubbing together, which they are, so Iran and Russia and China, I'm not saying they're best friends and have slumber parties, but they're collaborating in a way that we haven't seen coordinated in this way. That is really problematic. And when you talk about not emboldening Putin, they're all watching this, right? And it's not as if China isn't concerned about how does this play out in Ukraine. They've been holding back. They're not involved in it. I think they're one of the few countries that hasn't put their moral support with Ukraine. I think they've been reticent. That's significant. And I think there's a way in which we've often talked about the way our enemies are looking at us as an audience. Now, what do we signal to them? If we're weak, that encourages them. And when you have an audience of collaborating, coordinating authoritarians and dictatorships, that's a very powerful signal of where the world's heading in terms of conflict and the risks that we face. So I have a lot of concern about that.
Yeah, and they seem to be all united by the hatred of the United States, or by wanting to see ill come to the West, United States and its allies. That's the one thing they all share, and they kind of feed off of any failure of the U.S., any weakness the U.S. shows. Again, another reason why you're right. I mean, the Chinese are clearly watching Ukraine to see how the West reacts, which gives them a signal in terms of how the West will react if they go after Taiwan. And Iran is constantly trying to play off the West and find weaknesses and exploit those weaknesses. So it's the bad guys all teaming up is they're all teaming up against one enemy, and that is, Western civilization.
And I think this is an interesting issue to connect to your earlier question when we started with, which is this perspective that I wouldn't say it was universally held, but it had a lot of currency in the early 2000s, late 90s, this whole end of history narrative that I've been bashing. And the way to connect it, one way to connect it is you aren't taking ideas seriously if you don't see that there are dictatorships in the world and they're driven by certain goals, and that there's a path, there's a direction which you can expect them to follow given certain circumstances, so the idea that, well, history's ended and this is I forget when it is, 1993 or something like that, it comes out. The Iranians had their revolution in 79. The fatwa against Rushdie is 89. The Iran-Iraq war is 89. Okay, you have to be thinking about that. And the idea that we've reached the apex of political development. And I have one more thing to say about this. I know this might not be the thing you want to talk most about.
No, this is good.
I want to say something about the idea that the conception of liberal democracy as the apex. Now, there's a lot of good in how people view liberal democracies. It's the closest thing they have to a free society. And it's good if they are in favor of that. But as you said, it's really a mixed economy. And that's a differentiated, a distinctive conception that Ayn Rand argues for, that you have to really understand what that means. And I was really critical of Fukuyama, and maybe I'm being just mean and petty, but he's just think of him as a scholar. One of his most recent books is Liberalism and Its Discontents. And I read that book because I wanted to see, what does Fukuyama think these days? And he basically said, yeah, there were things that didn't get everything right, but so there's real problems with people who are not in favor of liberal democracy, and it's a problem. Here are some ways we can get around it. But what he hasn't given a moment's thought to is the essential question of what is liberal democracy? And what he advocates for is, well, we just need to tweak the ways in which it's mixed. And that will appease the populists, so-called, and that will appease the woke people that he's upset about. And we can find a middle path. And if ever there's a lesson here that has gone unlearned, is that there's no middle path. There's no, the mixed economy is not stable. It has a certain trajectory unless certain important changes are made. And he's the kind of intellectual who, while recognizing the problems, won't go a level deeper to see, oh, you know what? I'm actually fostering this problem. I'm making it worse by the kind of solutions I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And they all seem to want to evade the fundamental nature of the West, and the ideas that led to even the liberal democracy. So they completely ignore the good side of liberal democracy, which is capitalism, which is individual rights, but the protection of individual rights, and the foundation for that is egoism and individualism, or individualism and reason, and respect for reason, which they don't. The conception of what they consider civilization is bizarre. I think our enemies understand what makes the West better than we do, right? Than I think our own intellectuals and politicians do. I think they understand that the West is fundamentally about individualism. That's why they make such a big deal of making fun of our individualism, and they understand that we stand for reason, and they make fun of that. They emphasize the mysticism. Both Putin, Iran, North Korea, and I think China as well. They all have some greater goal, some greater thing that they're fighting for, and so it's hard to get anybody excited to fight for liberal democracy. Let's go fight for mixed economy. This is going to really get us excited, and it's a real problem that I think that the West has right now. I think with Ukraine, what are we fighting for? This greatness. And
that's one of the criticisms of the Fukuyama perspective these days. So his latest view just is it's beyond uninspiring. It's actually depressing, because the opponents make a good argument about why this system is really problematic, and you're not able to answer it. So what do you expect people to go to the barricades for this?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the enemy The enemy's motivated because they at least have an ideal. It's a rotten ideal. It's an evil ideal, but they have an ideal, and they can motivate and they can get people engaged in an ideal, even a rotten one, better than the grayness of the West. I mean, luckily, the grayness of the West, because we have a little bit of freedom, still allows us to be richer and more powerful than the bad guys, at least for a while. So, you know, in Russia right now, in the Russia-Ukraine issue right now, voices in the West almost constantly, particularly in America, and mostly on the right, are urging negotiations and a peace deal. And it's fascinating that it's coming from the right. Usually it's the left demanding peace deals. And it very much reminds me of the same demands being made of Israel. What do you think? What do you think of this, and why do you think it's coming from the right? What's happened to the American right that they view Putin as, I don't know, as the good guy somehow, or at least not as evil as he certainly is?
Okay, let me take the one part of that first. So,
that was a lot of that is multiple questions in one.
That's fine. It's fascinating. I've been thinking a bit about that. Why is there this push for a negotiated peace agreement? I think that it's a narrow, short-range perspective on the stakes and a desire to get out of the problem because it's hurting support politically, or might harm their Americans have cooled on the idea. I mean, I remember when this conflict began, there were school drives to send gifts and toys and teddy bears to kids in Ukraine. And there was just a really powerful outpouring that you don't hear or see very often. And that was the grassroots. Nobody was coordinating that. There's just people spontaneously flying the Ukrainian flag. But I think that's gone away, as many of these things do. It fades. It's hard to sustain outrage and concern with injustice for 2+ years, and to ask Americans to do that, because nobody's giving them a good case for that. So I can see why
there's no principled defense. So it's so easy for people to forget and not quite understand what the hell is going on.
And I think the people pushing for this, they're never in it because of the principle. They're in it because, well, we have to do something. And now it's, well, we don't have to do anything anymore. Let's get rid of the problem. And this is a good case study of there's a real appetite for peace deals. And I've studied one of them in depth. That's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I've studied other ones, but not as in depth. And I think there's a kind of a mystique around this. So there's the Northern Ireland Agreement, there's the Israeli-Palestinian, there's a number of the really famous cases. Nobody can look at this and say, oh yeah, we figured out how to do this, and we know how to reach agreements with hostile adversaries who are literally killing us in the streets, and come to a resolution, and we've got the recipe for this. It's just not true. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict was seen as that in the first decade or so. Oh, yeah, this is going great. We can figure this out, and then the whole thing collapses. The people who are for it collapse. It's just culturally, it was, even the people most ardently for it realized this is crazy. We're not going to get anywhere. And why is that? And we can transfer some of the lessons of this to Putin. The key premise is, I think you mentioned it, he's not that bad. I mean, we could live up to an agreement if we came to it. It was just figure out the terms. And this is the classic error people make that Ayn Rand talks about, which is you're confusing compromise and appeasement. Compromise is something legitimate. If you have another party that you share common ground with, you can adjust the details within a principle. But appeasement is you're pretending to adjust the details, but you're conceding the principle. And the principle here is Ukraine is a sovereign country. It wants to be freer, and you're conceding that by saying, no, you can have a few. What's Putin going to be satisfied with? Give him a few more 1,000 miles worth of Ukrainian territory, or give him the whole of Ukraine? What do you think is going to be satisfying to someone who's doing unspeakable things to the Ukrainian people? And then what makes these kinds of deals credible it has to involve whitewashing. And so I think anyone pushing for this is going to be responsible for saying, well, Putin can live up to a deal. Okay, really? Where's your
Well,
evidence?
he hasn't in the past, right? He's never lived up to a deal. I mean, he certainly didn't live up to the Minsk agreement or any of the other agreements he signed. But dictators never do.
Exactly. So it's ignoring the fact that he's a dictator, and then that's good. This is my prediction. The more this is pushed, the more he gets whitewashed. This is an interesting reason to kind of reflect on the Tucker Carlson campaign.
Yeah.
It's like, what is the timing for that? And is that sort of a weather balloon for getting Putin sanitized in preparation for pushing harder on a peace agreement? I don't know. This is completely speculative, but let me say one other thing about this.
It seemed to be enough to sanitize Putin so that he could kill Navalny 2 days after the interview. And so he basically got a thumbs up from that interview, okay, to kill Navalny, because Tucker Carlson never even mentioned Navalny in the interview.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to talk more about the interview. Just to get one more thought on the issue of what the sort of idea of Putin's not interested in a peace deal. So the idea that you now have to do what you did with Iran is like to woo him to the table. Like the whole idea, he said, why would I agree with him? Because they're losing? Like he's at least open about the fact that this is stupid. And then if you think about other agreements like this, that are essentially appeasing, they can't go your way because you're surrendering a crucial value, a crucial principle. You can't expect it to go your way. So to me, it's what you can expect from a deal like that is at best a temporary pause until something worse happens. I don't think there's reason to expect anything good. You also raised the question about the American right or the conservative movement in America. Yep. I'm fascinated by that. I mean, one of the areas I'm most interested in doing more writing is the development of the American right to where it has gotten today. How did it get into this pit, this gutter of anti-intellectualism, where you go? I saw something on Twitter that I'm sure people have seen a lot. You get, and it really captures something. You get Reagan, who I'm not a fan of, and there's a lot to say about Reagan, but there was something more American about him. Reagan went and made this famous speech saying, "Tear down this wall," referring to the Berlin Wall. Okay, it's important to remember, even people who liked Reagan thought he went too far. So he was, pushing it. And then since then, everyone said, oh, this was really one of his low points. But a lot of people responded to that favorably. And there was something sort of at a sense of life level. What Ayn Rand calls a sense of life is this emotional level understanding of ideas. And there was something about it that was on the right moral wavelength. Let's put it that way. So that's Reagan, 1980, whatever, 88, 89, whatever. I can't remember exactly when it was. And then you get, if I'm in power, I'll let Putin do whatever the hell he wants. Okay, so this is your conception of, this is the evil empire, as Reagan called it. And this is, well, Putin's a great guy. People respect him. He has loyal generals. Okay, there's something really corrupt about a political enterprise that goes from what is Reagan's, in my view, still quite weak statement to, okay, you do whatever the hell you want, we admire dictators. And I think the admiration of Putin, and leave aside Trump, so you could say Trump is a special case, but the admiration of Putin it's horrifying. I read a piece in the Hillsdale publication called Imprimis. And a lot of people get this. There's like 30 million people get this newsletter. And it's basically excerpts or condensations of speeches that they give. And in Hillsdale, for people who are not aware, Hillsdale's core to the intellectual world of the conservative movement. So Hillsdale hosted a journalist, scholar type called Christopher Caldwell. I don't know if you're familiar with him. And this is around 2017, I think this was. I'm not good with dates, but this was long before Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And Christopher Caldwell is a really skilled writer. He's very smart, and he knows how to couch things in a way that doesn't make him sound crazy, even when he's saying things that are horrifyingly crazy and irrational. So what does he say in this speech turned article? well, you guys think Putin's this terrible guy, but look at all the good things he's done. Look at the way he's supporting sort of in effect conservative values and religion and tradition and national identity and in effect he's got a hard situation. He's got to deal with all kinds of social problems and he's got to deal with a bad neighborhood. And it's not quite the Tucker Carlson level of whitewashing. It's much more subtle. It's got an argument. But that's really what it is. It's laying the groundwork for, well, there's something admirable about him. And then you get sort of the more carnival barker, less intellectual people who are more the influencers, social media types who are now barking admiration of people like Viktor Orban and Vladimir Putin. Maybe they don't go all the way to Putin, but they love Orban and the National Conservatives, which I know you've debated National Conservatives. I've written about them. They hosted him at one of their events, Viktor Orban, and they didn't just host him as let's figure out where we agree and disagree. It was more like Viktor Orban, let us bow down to your awesomeness and look at the success story that you've made out of your country. We have things to learn from you. That's really what they did. Now,
which is kind of funny because Hungary's a complete failure, right? The economy is unsustainable without subsidies from those leftists at the EU.
That he's constantly snubbing, right? That's part of what they like about him. Like he's giving it to the EU the way, you know, we can snub the
He doesn't survive without the checks from the EU. Hungary would collapse tomorrow without those checks. High inflation, it's a real disaster.
And yet, and so this is, now think about what conservatism used to be. It was fiscally responsible, militarily confident, and just the reputation of being for free markets and the markets are going to solve things. The government's the problem. The sort of idea that they're associated with capitalism, and a lot of them have shied away from that. But this is the movement that has gone from that reputation, at least, or that cultivated reputation, to we're good with Orban, we're good with all these family. He's got programs to foster childbirth. He's got tax cuts for babies, basically, and there's just an alarming level of government control over the media. Maybe what I've read, and I don't have up-to-date knowledge, but when I read about this a while back, it was not really a free media, and the elections were not. I don't think you'd call the elections totally straight. So the idolizing of someone like him makes the admiration of someone like Putin less surprising, because what they value are these non-essential things that are tribal. They're religion, family, tribe, identity, sort of racial identity. And I think this is an issue that people don't understand enough about with Orban, which I think there's a really strong ethnic aspect to him. And I don't know if I would go so far as to say it's racial, but there's implications in his anti-Semitism that it's basically a racial conception of what the national identity is. And they love national identity. That's a whole thing that they've been pushing the last 5 years. Their conception of nationalism, which is now trying to take over the movement, it is essentially an identitarian, it's about racial identity and tribal identity. And that is just the farthest thing from individualism as you can get. And so it's really a trajectory, not just down, but like scraping into the gutter and going down to the sewer, in my view, intellectually.
And it seems that, I mean, what they care about, it seems the new right seems to care about social issues. They care about babies, lots of them. They don't like abortion, and they don't like contraception. They want the state to subsidize babies, and they don't like gays for a variety of reasons. And they like religion. And Orban, even though every indication in the world suggests he's an atheist, or was an atheist at least, talks about religion constantly, hates gays, and subsidizes babies. And Putin, of course, is religious and hates gays, makes a big point of that, and also is trying to subsidize babies and talks it up. And it seems like that trumps everything. You know, there's this article. I don't know if you've seen it. I did a show on this of Jordan Peterson, where he says, look, Putin's actually on the side of the Western civilization. It's the EU that is leftist nuts, and they're moving away from Western civilization because they view everything through this lens of religion and these social issues that relate to that. Nothing else seems to matter. And Jordan Peterson, yeah, he shouldn't have invaded Ukraine, but let's not forget we can't alienate him because he's one of us. He's a real Westerner because, I don't know, Jesus take the wheel. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, I've heard you talk about this issue, and I've been thinking about it for a while too, which is that I think this started in Europe with in part a reaction to the assertive Muslim community, and the Europeans for the last 2 decades have been asking themselves, who are we? What are we for? And how do we get people to assimilate? Maybe we shouldn't assimilate, maybe not. And we've seen what happened to Europe. But I remember going to a conference here in California where a lot of people from Europe, a lot of really prominent American intellectuals were asking this same question, like, what is the identity of Europe? What is the West that we're trying to defend? And my view is that was 2007. They didn't have any answers back then. One of the speakers was Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Daniel Pipes spoke there, just a number of people that you would associate with this kind of issue. And it goes to this issue this is what you've been talking about in other contexts, which is the West, as it's understood, is just too vague a concept. You could argue it's a package deal. It's putting together both religion and best elements of the Enlightenment. There's a reason to try to unpack that, because what happens is the argument is, well, religion is central to the West. And if you just do it in terms of history, religion was a big part of the West for a long time, and that's not wrong. But is it essential to the West? And that people aren't willing to really think about. When we think about what is good about Western societies today, by Western here, I'm going to slightly concretize it. It's like America, the United Kingdom, and France. What are the best elements of those countries? It's the freest elements, the more Enlightenment-rooted ideas. But that's what people aren't willing to acknowledge. What they want to say is this whole idea of religion, tribe, our tradition. And that's what the Enlightenment was a rebellion against. Like, why do you care about tradition? Why do you care about religion? The level of mockery of religion in the Enlightenment will shock people who read about it today. The idea that tradition is any kind of endorsement, that they mock mercilessly. Now, and the Enlightenment was a varied group of people, so you have to understand some of the variation. But basically, it was, what are you talking about? How could you be for religion and tradition and the group? The individual is the source of knowledge, so the source of value. Individuals can gain knowledge. And when we talk about the West, you and I and others were on this premise, it's precisely the best aspects, the freer, individualist, reason-oriented perspective on the West. And so when you get Jordan Peterson telling you that Putin is part of the West, a lot of people buy that because part of what they like is, we have better societies here. But this is part of how a malformed concept or a package deal operates. People respond to the parts of it that they like sometimes, and then they swallow the parts that don't belong there.
No, I mean, I think that's a fundamental issue, is that people don't understand what the West represents and what it stands for, and what they should be fighting for. And they are super confused about this. I've done some events with Douglas Murray on this, and he's super confused about it. He can't separate out the Enlightenment values from the religious elements. And indeed, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who just became religious, kind of, it's almost like, but if we adopt Enlightenment ideas, then we will lose meaning, we will lose purpose, we will lose significance, we will lose our identity. And that, Douglas Murray's an atheist. Ayaan Hirsi Ali was an atheist until recently. That is the real problem in the West, is they do not have a set of ideologies that connect the Enlightenment to personal values, to morality, to actually to purpose and meaning. And you said this earlier, you can't get passionate, you can't fight excitedly over something that has no purpose and meaning. So, and there's a certain admiration, I think, and this is what the right, I think, sees, for Putin and Orban. They stand for something. They believe in something. It's, you know, we know it's rotten to the core, but they stand and believe in something. And I think this is the problem with Muslim immigration into Europe, is it's the inability of Europeans to assimilate them, or even to try to assimilate them, because they don't know who they are.
Yeah.
You know, what do they assimilate them into? Convert them to Christianity? Is that what it means to be Western?
Yeah. I don't want to talk too much about Europe because it's,
Yeah.
I mean, there's things to say, but the European situation is, there's pre Charlie Hebdo, and then there's post Charlie Hebdo. And what, in my view, it's things were getting worse in the early 2010s, 2000s. And I think Charlie Hebdo and the attacks in Paris that happened later that year, I think those were symptomatic of a community that became, they were assertive to begin with, and there was no pushback on it, no intellectual pushback. And it was, in my view, is a symptom of Europe's intellectual collapse. And this whole idea of who are we? There's things that you would describe as solutions, the kind of assimilation guidebooks that they offered people coming in the early 2000s, that they're a punchline, right? And it's no surprise that when you get a lot of people who don't share those values, you get a lot of social problems. And this was actually Ayaan Hirsi Ali's last book was about the treatment of women in Europe by largely Muslim immigrants, and it was horrifying. And I think and I think largely substantiated by the evidence. But none of this should be surprising when you have a society that doesn't understand what it stands for. Yep. And can't bring people to. So I think that is a fundamental issue. And to me, the reaction of saying, well, Orban or Putin or some other thug like that, he's got something right. That is another symptom of that, which is, if you can't see through it, then you're really lost. And I think that part of what they're responding to is, and I think this goes along with tribalism, they're responding to someone will tell us what to do. The appeal of authoritarianism isn't just, oh, he's strong, he stands for something. It's, well, okay, I'll have answers. They'll tell me what to do. I'm going to belong to this tribe, and this is the leader. And okay, well, I don't have to do a lot. And I think that goes to some of what you see in the American right. That it's not an accident that they like the power that these people have. Like if they weren't quite as powerful, I don't think it would be as tempting.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you know, the other thing that's unfortunately going to happen in Europe, and I think we'll see it in the next few months, we saw it in the Portugal election a few days ago, is that they're going to be a lot more Orbans and a lot more Putins in Europe, inside Europe. The new right, the national conservative right, is very strong in Europe right now. And European elections are being held in a couple of months, and they're going to dominate those elections, I fear. And Portugal just had an election, and the far right party did phenomenally well. And I expect Germany. People are going to be shocked by how bad it is in Germany. But this is, Ayn Rand predicted this, right? A mixed economy has to go either towards more freedom. That's not happening. And therefore it has to go, otherwise it goes towards more statism. And the world is going towards greater statism. And the leftist type of statism is kind of bankrupt. So the world is going towards right right-wing collectivistic, nationalistic statism.
I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that. But I would add one more thing to that, which is, and I agree. I think I keep every opportunity I have where it's not obnoxious, I tell people she saw us coming but one of the places to look at is, it's right that her analysis of the mixed economy is incredibly relevant to this. The other piece of it is what she called global Balkanization. And that's the fragmentation of societies into modern day tribes. So tribes within societies the way you don't expect them. So if you go to Africa, the underdeveloped parts of the world, you say, yeah, this is the default, people are tribal. When you go to the Western world, Europe, America, Canada, you don't expect tribes. But that's what was forming about 50 years ago. And she saw this as a trend that was rising. And some of it was manifested in secessionist movements or breakaway people who want to create their own country out of little pockets of Spain and little pockets of England and Wales and so forth. And there's just dozens and dozens of these examples. But what it has developed into, because I think it's a continuous trend, what is developed into is just the fragmentation into tribes within society. So when we've been talking about the conservative movement, I don't think of it as essentially an intellectual enterprise or even a political enterprise anymore. I think it's always been a conglomeration of social groups, ideas, and political goals. But I think those elements have shifted to the point where it's mostly a tribal collection, and the ideas are really like a tail. Like they're really an appendage, not the core. Even if you could argue, was it ever the core? But it's become such a peripheral thing that it's essentially just we're one tribe, and the woke are another tribe, or the progressives are another tribe, and then there's sub-tribes. There's the squad tribe, and there's the old school. That's also reinforced by a mixed economy, but the driver for that balkanization, that tribalism, is deeper than politics. I think the driver for that is intellectual. It's the collapse of philosophy as a power in our culture. And this goes to the point that you made, where who's going to fight for the mixed economy? Who's going to be inspired by it? And there's no inspiration because nobody's defending the values that matter. Capitalism, individualism, and reason. When those aren't defended, why would anyone flock to them?
Yep, absolutely. So let's turn to Israel a little bit. Now, I want to let everybody know next week, Elan's going to come back on Thursday, and we're going to analyze the debate that was done on the Lex Fridman show, which was 2 against 2, and it goes for like 5 hours. So we couldn't do it today because the debate just hit Lex Fridman's channel, and 5 hours is a long time to listen and then to think and then to analyze and to comment on. So we'll be ready for next Thursday with an analysis of the debate on the Israeli-Palestinian issue on Lex Fridman. I'm not looking forward to sitting through 5 hours of that, particularly given that I don't respect any one of the people debating. Indeed, I despise 3 of the 4. I don't despise Destiny, but I'm not a fan of Benny Morris's for a variety of reasons. Given his history, and Destiny, I'm just blah about. So that and another 2, the 2 representing the Palestinians, which are just, one of them at least is monstrous. Anyway, we'll be doing that on Thursday. I'm also going to be doing a debate on the Israeli-Palestinian thing with a Palestinian libertarian, which should be interesting. This will be on Sunday, not this Sunday, the following Sunday. So actually, I'm going to ask you, Elan, for some book recommendations in preparation for that. So tell us a little bit about, your reaction to October 7th, not so much, obviously, the horror of it, but were you surprised that it happened? And if you weren't surprised, why? And what did you think would happen following it?
I wasn't surprised, and I have to admit, I thought it was, when I first heard about it, I thought, oh, it's just like what happened in 2021, rockets, they infiltrated. I didn't realize the severity of it for a good hour or so. I had another work event planned, and we canceled it. Good thing we did, but I think I was being naive in how awful it was. And so in that sense, I wasn't surprised, but I was shocked at the horror of it. What did I think would happen? I think we went on the air that day, and one of the things I said is, I'm counting the minutes until whatever moment of sympathy Israel manages to eke out from this is extinguished. And what we actually have in a few minutes is the predictable war crimes narrative, the chorus about pulling back, restraint, innocence, and everything that you've heard right now. And it's not because I have some fantastic power to predict anything. It's just you follow this issue long enough, And it's a predictable pattern, and it's predictable precisely because of the ideas that people hold and the assumptions that they make that drive them to make these horrible accusations. And so that was my initial thought at the time. But the one aspect of it that I did not expect, that I think really did surprise me, and I'm still thinking about it. I don't know that I've fully processed it, but it's the reaction in the streets and on campus.
Yeah.
And when I have to say, the campus side of it, there's always been young people on campus. There's a lot of stuff that they do that seems like they're young. You got to give them some room. They get, and some of it comes from being idealistic. So you can't treat it all as they're all fanatical. But then what they actually do, it's much less defensible, much less excusable. And I was talking about this with my colleague Onkar Ghate, some the viewers know about it, and the way he put it, I think, was really helpful. He said, part of what October 7th did is it exposed the nature of academia. The
Yep.
people have not, it was not new, it was there for a long time, but it suddenly became real and visceral and hard to ignore. And that piece of it, I'm dumbfounded. Every day I see things that I think, how is this possible that this is a reputable institution? This is someone who spent 2 decades in education becoming an expert, and this is what they say on a topic. That, I think, has been horrifying. The people in the streets, I think there's a significant difference between Europe and the US. I think there's a lot of terrible protests that we've seen in the US outside of campus. But the things I've seen in London, I think this is, right now there's basically a weekly protest in London, from what I gather. And in the first months or two, there were these massive protests. I don't know if they're the biggest, but they're among the biggest protests that have happened in a long time. And that it's not against Hamas, right? And that's the horrifying thing. It's that in the way in which that narrative of, I don't know if it's the right thing to call it, but this whole idea that this is about liberating Palestinians. How could you possibly believe that? And the scale of evasion about what Hamas is, and the idea that you could credibly believe that the Palestinians have been living under some beneficent government in Gaza, it's crazy. And it's just, now you've agitated me, and there's a lot more to say about this, but those are the two things, the campus, and then the kind of gross evasion of the actual initiator of the conflict.
Yeah, no, I think that surprised me too the most is the responses on the campuses, and less so in the streets, because a lot of those are kind of we're paying the price of not assimilating the immigrants. But campuses, and the day after, right, they didn't even have any time to absorb it, but they immediately knew who were the guilty party and who was the innocent, and they immediately blamed Israel without any need for data or fact or evidence. The Palestinians were the good guys. It became so evident. Any sense on where this goes and how this ends?
The war itself, or the kind of cultural reaction?
The war itself, the attitude, the whole phenomena of what's going on right now.
I think the war is, I've been telling people when I speak about this subject, I would love for there to be a good resolution to this. I think there are options that are good or that would lead to a good outcome. But I don't have confidence in the Israeli government to do what needs to be done, which is to defeat Hamas. They talk about it, and I've met people who are involved, and they're trying to push this way and that way. And my attitude is good. I'm glad to hear it. I don't believe it's going to work.
Yeah.
And partly that's based on some of the things that we learned about the policy prior to October 7th, and the complacency. And there was a time when there was some recognition that Hamas really exists to destroy Israel. But that you can't really believe that and behave the way that they behaved in the weeks and months before October 7th as a policy. And I think the idea that so that I think is not encouraging. The other thing, and I've written about this from a different angle, which is the story in 2014, which was the longest conflict prior to this one, where there was a ground war, there was rockets, there was a sort of ground invasion. The story about that was this was Israel's war crime. There was a big UN report that came out, the Goldstone report, you might remember, if people want to look that up. And that was a defining moment. What happens after this? I don't think it's recoverable, because every single day now, it's the whole way in which this is being understood is irrational from top to bottom. And the idea that this ends with Israel, okay, so they defeated Hamas, but Israel's now, they're already talking about it being a pariah nation because of what? Because it's defending itself and not supplying enough trucks. I mean, the fact that we're asking what's the right number of trucks of aid into Gaza is the wrong question. There should be, I can tell you what the right number is. It's 0. And the fact that we're building, we might talk about this more, but the fact that there's now being built a floating pontoon, this pier to deliver more, and the whole story is the people in Gaza are suffering. There's famine. They're getting that's the story. Okay, whose fault is that? And the idea that it's exclusively Israel's fault, and it's Israel's, the latest crime I read about Yaron is that Israel is not just slowing the trucks, it has the temerity to inspect what's in there. And the inspections are too stringent. It's slowing things down. And people okay, so now imagine any other context where the problem is the number of aid trucks you're delivering to your enemy. How is that rational? And so
but the whole setup is irrational, right? Because the whole setup was that Gaza was under blockade and nothing could get in and out, and you couldn't get food and you couldn't get electricity. When it turns out Israel's supplying them with electricity, with water, with food, with everything before the war, and now is expected to continue to supply them with all of that during the war. And it doesn't matter what the Palestinians do. Israel is supposed to roll over and let them get away with anything. Let's do some questions. We've gone for an hour already, and we can take some questions. Let me just thank some people. Let's start with Mary Aline, $50. Thank you, Mary Aline. Where are you? There's Mary Aline for nuts, a little bit more, and then Stephen Harper, thank you. Mike Dial, Wes, $100. Thank you, Wes. That's very generous. All right, let's jump for some for some of the super chats here, although oh, John. All right, I'll do this one quickly, Elan. I know we talked about this before, and you have no comment for this one. Yaron, you haven't discussed the Crumbly case yet, have you? I'm curious about your thoughts on the mother and father of a 15-year-old shooter being charged with involuntary manslaughter. I personally didn't follow the case. If the boy was tried as an adult, isn't that in itself identifying that he should have known better and that he did what he did in his own free will? Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody's denying that he did what he did with his own free will. That is, that he is ultimately responsible. That's why he was tried as an adult. And so that's an indication. The question is, are the parents complicit? That is, did they aid and abet? Right? It's clear that they didn't pull the trigger. It's clear you couldn't have prosecuted the kid as an adult if he was just being manipulated by the parents 100%. But were the parents complicit? And you could argue, and I haven't followed the case close enough to know that this is the case, but you could argue that the parents, by providing him with a gun, in spite of the fact that they had every reason to believe that he was mentally unstable, every reason to believe that he might abuse this gun, that he might do something horrible with the gun, they still encouraged him to, or still gave him a gun and made it available to him, that is so irresponsible, given that he's 15 years old and given the mental state he was in, that they should be tried for that as accessories. So not as responsible for the manslaughter, but as accessories to it. So that would be my view. And in that sense, I think the court seems to have gotten it right. I don't know that I would add or subtract anything from what the court did, unless you have some evidence to suggest that I'm getting this all wrong, which is completely possible. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Ilana. Do you want to go to the next?
No, let's go to the next one. Thanks.
All right, this one is from Ali Al-Rahal. Al-Rahal. Oh, I can't pronounce it. All right, if Enlightenment values are separate from religion, why don't we see the same values across different cultures from different religions?
I'm not sure I totally get it, but so
I think
enlightenment,
I think he's suggesting, aren't enlightened values coming out of Christianity or necessarily coming out of Christianity? Can you really separate them from Christianity given the historical sequence?
okay. So if the question is asking, isn't the fact that there's diverse views in religion evidence that the Enlightenment is the core of the West and religion isn't, then I think there's a long history to say about a long history for each religion to understand its relationship to the Enlightenment. And I think some religions will be more influenced by it than others. But I don't feel I fully get the question, but let me offer this other thought. The Enlightenment as an intellectual enterprise viewed itself as a contrast to religion.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that there's some fusion, now some of them were religious, but not all of them, and many of them were atheists or deists, meaning that they saw religion as this, you set it up and you leave it, and God's not really part of the picture. They definitely saw themselves as standing in contrast to religion, and I mentioned that they ridiculed religion. Now, that you have to understand that's not like ridiculing religion in the Book of Mormon today. Like, you can do that on Broadway. You couldn't ridicule religion back in the Enlightenment. That was a very risky thing to do. And that speaks to religion's hold on people's minds. And so when you do that, you're signaling, yeah, I don't accept your view that I have to bow to a religious figure. So maybe the person wants to ask the question a different way, but I'm not sure I'm able to offer more than that.
I mean, I'll add this. So Ali says, he's writing in the chat, we don't see Enlightenment values in other countries. We only see it in Western Christian countries. Yes, but here's the thing about the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is fundamentally Greek. It's fundamentally a product of the Renaissance. It's a product of the resurrection of Greek ideas. So Ali, you mentioned in the chat before the Islamic Golden Age. The Islamic Golden Age was a product of Greece. It was a product of the Arabs translating the Greek philosophers, taking them seriously, engaging with them, challenging them, and as a consequence, also adopting science and technology and really advancing mathematics and science, huge advances under the Arabs of the Golden Age and later in Spain. And that's exactly what happened in Christianity. That is, this Greek element entered into Christianity, both from the Arabs and from the Byzantines, and ultimately landed up with people like, what's his name? The guy who, Eloise, who was the guy with
Abelard.
Abelard. Abelard. And then why I remember Eloise, but I don't remember Abelard. I have no idea, the weird state of memory. And Aquinas and all of that. And it came into Europe and those ideas, those Greek ideas that traveled westwards. Why they didn't catch on in Persia, why they didn't catch on in India, it's hard to tell. I don't know. It's something about those cultures that prevented them, but they never got caught on then. They did get caught up. And Alexander the Great, I think, by invading those areas, tried to bring some of those Greek ideas there, but it never caught there. It did catch in the West. It had nothing to do with Christianity, because it also caught in Islam. It has nothing to do with the monotheistic religions. By the way, Jews were influenced heavily by Greek philosophy. Maimonides, who's a Jewish philosopher from the 13th or 14th century, was also heavily influenced by Aristotle and the Greeks. And that is what led to the Enlightenment. So it did all that in spite of Christianity. Christianity was the enemy. Christianity was the opposite. And everything that these Greek ideas are filtering through are fighting the Christian ideas. And the Enlightenment is when they come to dominate intellectually, at least among some intellectuals. And Christianity's still fighting them to this day. It's fighting. Now, what happened in the Muslim world and everything, that's for another time, in terms of why they didn't catch on there permanently. But to think about the Enlightenment as Christian is to miss the point. The Enlightenment, exactly as Elan said, is the rejection and making fun of Christianity. I mean, even the Enlightenment figures who were religious were not Christian. Voltaire was not an atheist. He believed in a God, but he made fun of Christians all the time. He hated Christianity as a religion, even though he himself, and of course, he had to run away from France and he had to live in Switzerland in order to survive, because Elan's absolutely right. In those days, to ridicule religion could easily be a death sentence. All right, this one's for you. What are your thoughts on U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer calling for Bibi Netanyahu's resignation?
Yeah, I read about that last night. I think there's two things I would say. One is I'm not a fan of Netanyahu. I don't think he's the best leader for Israel. I think there's a lot. It's important to remember he was trying to modify important features of the Israeli legal system, and it's controversial. And I think it takes work to figure out whether that was the right thing to do. I'm not convinced it's the right thing to do. And that led to some of the biggest protests in Israel's history. So it's really important to see that Netanyahu he's very problematic. And so I can understand people saying he's got to go. I don't think you want to do that in the middle of a war. I don't think that's responsible. And so I think what Chuck Schumer is doing is the dirty work that Biden doesn't want to do. It's a very political move. Biden is trying to push against Israel. He can't really do it, but he needs to do it. And so Schumer, who better, right? A very senior member of Congress who's Jewish, who's seen as he vetoed various things. He vetoed the Iran deal. He has credibility on these issues. I think that's it. And I think it's a pretty dirty trick. In effect, it's like, this is what Biden administration needs to done. And you could kind of Chuck Schumer.
Why do you think Biden believes it? Why do you think Biden needs to do it? And why do you think, from his perspective, and why do you think he can't do it himself, or was too cowardly to do it himself?
Well, one of the things maybe this will come up when we talk about the debate next week, but one of the things that has been fascinating since October 7th is the impact of this on the Democratic Party. Because I think it definitely exposed, it's either, you can think of it as a generational problem. So Biden is the older generation, and the squad, or the newer generation, there's not only the squad, there's sort of the younger people. But you can think of it more, I'm hesitant to call it an intellectual division, but it's the more overtly nihilistic elements and the more traditional, we have a long, strong alliance with Israel. And I think that division in the party, I think there's a lot of concern that it already cost him. There's a whole campaign I think you might know about. Maybe we talked about this in Michigan, where in the primaries, people went in, I think it's uncommitted. And so this is a signal that, yeah, we're not going for Biden. We're telling you we're unhappy. And this has been done in other elections. So I think he's getting a sort of activist element in the party telling him, your support of Israel is going to cost you at the ballot box. So I think he's reacting to that. And why can't he do it himself? I don't know. I don't think Biden really, Biden has views. I think he does what he's told to do and has advisors, and they think this is the way to navigate this problem. You can't get it reelected and be this close to Israel. That's, I think, the way they're thinking of it. I mean, maybe there's more to say about that, but that's sort of the read I have since last night.
Do you think that the opposition that the Biden administration has for Israel going into Rafah is political in a sense of re-election, or would they be opposing this even independent of that?
I tend to think they would oppose it even if it wasn't an election year. And I think they've been hesitant to support Israel from the beginning, so from October. And I don't think you can argue that that was an election consideration. That was really far back, and people don't really, it doesn't factor in that early. So it's not enough time to tell people to leave northern Gaza. You got to hold back. You got to wait, give them a bit more time. Let's create a new corridor. This was all happening before December, right? And so I think there's something animating it that's maybe amplified by the election, but I think it's there, and it's not unique to Biden. I think this has been true of past administrations, and it goes to the core. You've written about this. This idea of what morality looks like in war, and it's essentially altruistic. It's essentially sacrificial. So yes, you have a right to self-defense, but don't dare act on it. That's the way I think of it, and it's sad because we saw this in previous conflict Israel's had with Gaza, but we saw it on an even bigger scale in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this was done to American troops. They were told to go in and here are your weapons, but don't shoot at anything and don't try to defend yourself. And that's direct result of the kind of conception of morality that they have. And it's not like you would get a very different response if you put different personnel in. It's just a very common view it's bipartisan, I think.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, this is altruism in action. It really is. And they really think they're doing this for moral reasons. It's all right. Justin asks, why should Americans care about Israel?
They
You
shouldn't.
wrote a whole book about this.
Yeah, they shouldn't care about Israel. There's no should about it. It's a question of what values do you have, and do you see them represented? Do you see them embodied in other countries? And if you do, you should care about that country. And it's because of the values that it embodies, not because of some other tribal or religious consideration. So if you ask me, should any random American care? No. But if he cares about individual rights, if he cares about progress, if he cares about what it means to live in a good society, and a good society is so very difficult to create and then sustain. If you care about those things, then you should look at the world and say, who's managed to do something like this? And in effect, those are countries that have a kindred value context. They basically share the spirit of America, the best elements of America's spirit. And to me, that's the essential reason to be interested in Israel, to be interested in Ukraine to a lesser degree, because I think Ukraine is not nearly as successful politically, but it's it speaks so well of any country that wants to get better. And I have to say, I've been listening. One of the benefits I get to working at the Ayn Rand Institute is I get to listen to Ayn Rand University courses. So you and Onkar did a course that was really fascinating. Onkar does a course that's just ended on objectivism. And one of the points that came up recently in the discussion of government, it really helped me see this issue in a much deeper way, which is if you reflect on the challenge of creating a government. So leave aside Israel, just the philosophic issue of what is a good government? It's not an obvious question. We often, it's very easy to think, yeah, the founders cracked it. Here's the document. But that is such a monumental achievement. And then they didn't even fully realize it. And it's still an achievement, right? So they got a lot of things right, and they made some big mistakes and moral failings along the way. But look at how far we got even with that, right? So it's such a difficult thing. And when you think of countries in the 20th century with all the pollution of sort of the bad intellectual trends in the 20th century, and you see a country arising, and not only arising in a sort of barren, not very fertile, it's a backwater, right, in the Middle East, and surrounded by hostile countries. And you think, wow, and they managed to do something pretty good. Like, it's good enough that they have technology and science and real advances. And you look at that and you think, okay, I don't respect their government, I don't like their policy, but that is its own kind of achievement. And I don't live in Israel by choice, and I know you don't live there by choice. But what I respect and admire is that they took a really difficult challenge, And they accomplished something really impressive. And this is by the standard of what is a good society for human beings anywhere and any time. And the ability to do that is just so the kernel here that I got from, I was describing this as something that came up in a discussion in Onkar's class. The kernel there is just to think philosophically about what is a good society and how difficult that is. And I think there's a gross underappreciation, both of the United States as an achievement, but then just of answering that question philosophically. You have to take that seriously. So to me, the answer is, yeah, if you care about these values, you care about countries that try to live up to them. And that is the essentially. And then there's sort of further layers to this, which you would say, their enemies are our enemies. Who do you think Hamas is? I mean, is it any different than Al-Qaeda in its intellectual goals, or Iran or Saudi? No, there's a common Islamist thread that runs through them. And so that adds to the reason to be concerned about it. And there's a lot of good things that have come out of that part of the world that Israel has been the locus for. So there's a lot there, but it's rooted in what I regard as rational values. Even if a lot of Israelis are irrational, even if a lot of Israelis are fanatically religious, the country is a sort of the government that it created constitutes a significant achievement.
Well, and the culture and the civilization that it's created. Yeah, I mean, earlier on in the chat, people were saying, well, you know, you guys support Israel because you're Jewish, or it's the only country you support in the world, or stuff like that. And the funny thing about that is, you won't find people who are in essential terms more critical of Israel than Elan and I can be. When we talk about Israel, qua Israel, but when you talk about Israel, it's situated in the Middle East, qua fighting against an enemy like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and Islamic totalitarianism more broadly, then yeah, Israel's the good guys. And they're about as good guy as anybody in the West. And just like I criticize the American government constantly, and I criticize European governments constantly, but we recognize that in spite of that, America, Europe, Israel, a lot better than Putin, Russia, Iran, Hamas. And if you can't tell the difference, as unfortunately many people don't seem to be able to these days, between the American government and the Russian government, Tucker, for example, certainly can't. He sees the Russian government as superior because I guess the subway is cleaner. If you can't tell the difference between Hamas and France, not a country I love particularly politically, I love their art, but nothing much more than that. If you can't tell the difference between those two things, then you're really confused out there. You really you're on the side of evil. You're on the side of the bad guys. You're diminishing good. And if you don't realize this is the point you were saying about Onkar, if you don't realize the massive political, cultural, civilizational achievement that is the West, we'll call it, then you've lost the plot. You really have. It's not that hard, right? I mean, Onkar says it, at a deep level, but even at a superficial level, just life is just so much better in spite of the subways being more dirty, I guess.
I have one other thought, just to very quickly.
Yeah.
I don't want to make this question dominant, but I resent being called a Jew. It's not because I'm self-hating. I don't think people understand what Jew means. And that's because I've thought a lot about it. And I can tell you, it's not easy to define what a Jew is, because it's not only religion, it's not only culture, it's not only ethnicity. And then when you get into ethnicity, it's very complicated, because none of your relatives have anything to do with none of my relatives. Like, it's ridiculous. And I resent it because to me, and I'm not saying this is true of the questioner, but it's a symptom of the culture we have, where people are now much more comfortable classifying and talking about people as, you are part of this tribe, you're part of that tribe. You don't know what I believe.
In this case, it's exactly the question. I mean, not the question, but the person mentioning this in the chat.
Yeah, you don't know what I believe. I'm not religious. I'm an atheist. I'm actually fairly militant as atheists go. And I think it's exactly the same thing as if you said to someone who's black and he says, well, you're black, why don't you vote for Biden? Like, which is the view Biden held, right? If you're not voting for me, you're not black. That is tribal thinking, and it's corrupt. And there's a sense in which I'm a Jew because my mother was, or my family were. But even then, what do you think that means? Is it a cultural issue? So to me, it's a good example of how you're not using your mind well if this is how you're thinking.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, the only time I feel Jewish is when I face people like that. I think I like Ayn Rand's statement about she's only a Jew in the face of anti-Semitism.
Mhm.
And I feel like on this chat of mine, I face anti-Semitism almost every show. So, but yes, I agree completely. I mean, we both left Israel. We both don't consider ourselves Jews in any respect, really, in our day-to-day lives. We both are militant atheists. I think that's fair to say. And but even the culture, I mean, I left Israel for a reason. It wasn't about religion. Israel is not a religious state. People don't get this. Israel is a very secular place. In some respects, it's more secular than the US. I was shocked at how religious Americans are when I came from Israel, because all the people I knew in Israel were atheists or very, very secular. And so it's Israel is this secular place, but it's a collectivistic state and a tribal state in many respects, and I hated that. So it's even the culture. I don't consider myself a cultural Jew. If I was a cultural Jew, I would have stayed in Israel. That's the place for cultural Jews. So yeah, I mean, it's horrible how tribal we have become, how tribal people have become. They can only think of people as tribal. And I think it's because they think of themselves as tribal and they project onto others.
Can I say one other thing about this, because this is quite irritating. So
Yeah. No, it's an irritating topic. I know.
The idea that one would be supportive of Israel because one is a Jew, there are people who have that perspective. I wonder if the person asking this question, or people who find the question engaging, understand the number of Jews who hate Israel and are chanting in the streets for a ceasefire, which essentially just means give Hamas a break so they can regroup and fight again. Now, I've made this point in other contexts because to me to put the point even more strongly, in the early 90s, when the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians was going strong, it was super popular in Israel. This was the intellectuals were for it. A lot of the public was for it. And what that means is that you can't even project that they're Israelis, therefore they hate Palestinians. It's not even remotely true. They were so supportive of a Palestinian state, which is another way of saying it's. I hate to be in the position of trying to refute a tribal argument, but the reality is you're not thinking if this is how you approach things. Like the idea that having a certain background determines the contents of your mind is just so insulting.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right, let's see. Apollo Zeus, your opinion of Russian GPS attack on the RAF aircraft Defense Secretary Grant Shapps was flying today. So I don't know if you saw the story.
No, I didn't see it yet.
Yeah, so he was flying, and it looks like somebody tampered with the GPS, I mean, remotely, of the plane. Everybody suspects Russia. I mean, my view is, I don't think anything happened, but my view is this is just Russia flexing its muscles. Russia saying we have A, the capacity, but B, you guys are hostile to us. We're gonna be hostile to you. We're not gonna tolerate this, and so they're playing games. It's like when they fly their planes really close to an American plane, or what did they do? They knocked out a few months ago. They knocked down one of the American drones above the Black Sea. They're sending a message. We won't tolerate you guys, and we have the capabilities to fight you. I think they're bluffing, but they're doing. All right, Daniel says, a large element of Iran seems very pro-American. Any idea how this came to be?
I don't know if I would say they're pro-American. I think they're pro-West generally, and there's a strong antipathy to the clerical regime, and we saw that for 2 years of the protests around women refusing to wear the hijab in Iran, which I think is incredibly brave protest that was not given the support, the moral support it really deserved in the US. Why are there people in Iran who are supportive of the West, or as the question puts it, America? I think that it was always true since before the revolution in Iran in 1979 that there was a significant population in Iran who were Western oriented. I think Iran as a country was interested in the West and more sophisticated than their neighbors in that part of the world. Travel, education were much more developed. And I think that in that sense, they were secular and leftist, right? I think that there was a significant constituency like that. And the Iranian Revolution, there were people who supported it and it became foisted on the whole of society, but there was always this undercurrent of people in Iran who were not interested in religion. And I actually spoke to a woman who escaped from Iran. She had to climb over mountains at night to get out of the country. She was one of the protesters of the hijab. Before it became a big national movement, it was a sort of, and my impression of her is she's not religious. Like, you told me to be religious and I had to pretend to be religious in school, and you told me to wear a headscarf. I didn't believe this stuff. It's what happens in the communist system too. You see, people go through the motions because that's what's expected of them. It doesn't mean they've completely swallowed the ideology. Now, there are people in Iran who have that, so I think it's important to get that. But so I think there's that latent community that some of them left. I mean, I think a lot of people left, and you see those communities. There's a big one here in California, but there are some who didn't leave, but they still were much more Western oriented. And I think they recognize we don't want to live under this kind of government. So that's my best guess at the answer.
Yeah, I mean, the Shah was very pro-West and brought in a lot of Western values, except freedom and respect for individual rights. But he did, there's a lot of Western culture that was brought in during the 60s and 70s. But even going further back, the West, the Iranians were very intrigued. The Persians were very intrigued with the West. And of course, Persia is a real civilization. And has always been more intellectual than the rest of that region, and has always been curious about knowledge. And they've always reached out to the West. So it doesn't surprise me, given the history and given, the Persians the Iranians are well-traveled. They've seen the West. And the internet, of course, brings all that much closer to them. But they've responded to it versus other places in the world that have it, because I think there's a deep civilizational thrust there. I mean, the election was just held in Iran, and the crazy religionists won overwhelmingly. But what's interesting is that according to the Iranians, right, according to the official Iranian numbers, only 25% of the people in Tehran voted. 75% stayed home, which is a stunning number in an authoritarian regime where you're expected to vote. Nationwide, only 45% of people voted. So these are all the lowest amounts since the revolution. So there's clearly something going on in Iran that is rejecting the current regime, which is some of the best news in the world out there, given how depressing these times are. The Gold Revolution, and now the fact that Iranians seem to be at least somewhat resisting this regime. That's all good. We'll see if they can take the next step towards revolution. All right, Dave Dean asks, would it be fair to suggest the U.S. politicians sending humanitarian aid to Gaza is an exercise of political pragmatism? In other words, if it works to gain votes, then they perceive it as good.
I don't think it's about votes. I mean, there might be politicians who act that way, but I don't think it's primarily about votes. I think there's the interesting thing about pragmatism. It's what I'm sure one of my colleagues could do a better job of this, but pragmatism, it just is you reject principles. You go by short-range thinking and what fills the void where you need values and principles. What fills the void is the conventional view that everybody grows up with, which is altruism, a self-sacrificial view. And so when they're pressed, where do they go for direction? there is no pragmatist answer to what to do, and they default to, and they think they're not being activated by ideas. So this is part of the irony of being a pragmatist, is that you think, yeah, we're just trying to solve problems. We're technocrats. We're just finding a way to make things better, right? And we're not ideologues. That's the alternative in their mind, is you're an ideologue or you're a pragmatist, right? You're solution oriented. And when they think they're acting in that way, when there's a crisis that tugs on their emotions, because that's what activates the altruist, it's emotional responses to things, that's what they're acting on. And so you get this blend of altruistic action. The Israelis are doing too much. They're being too assertive. They need to stop, and we need to get more trucks in there. We need to build a pontoon. We need to get more. Let's do airdrops. Let's do something. There's kids dying. Okay, well, that's not a pragmatic. That's not what a pragmatist will do, unless there's some. There might be a context where the pragmatic way of thinking leads them to this, but I think it's what it actually reveals is that ideas are inescapable. Philosophy is inescapable. In the end, the pragmatist, what fills the void intellectually or morally, just is the conventional view. And I think this is a point that is really, I take this sort of clarification. I hope I'm expressing it correctly, but in Leonard Peikoff's essay, Why Should One Act on Principle? This is part of what he says. Like there's always some principle active, even if you're defying principles. And what that means in this context is they think they're doing something smart and pushing towards a ceasefire, and there'll be a resolution. And maybe in their mind, this is what's happening. But when you listen to what they're saying and when you see what they do, this is essentially a self-sacrificial policy. It sacrifices Israel's interests, sacrifices America's interests. It's totally animated by people are suffering, send money. That's the ultimate catchphrase. And notice as well, like if you were really thinking, there's so many questions you would have to confront. What happens to all the aid? What happened to 20 years worth of aid? Where did it go? It went into tunnels. A tunnel system that's bigger than the London Underground, the Paris Underground, is like incredibly complicated. What's going to happen to the aid that we send now? Don't ask questions. Just serve the people who are needy. Okay. How sophisticated do you really think you are as a pragmatist if you're not asking those questions? Like, what's going to happen the day after tomorrow? We don't know. We don't care. We just want to. People are dying. Okay. Because the other irony about the pragmatists is that they think they're playing 5-dimensional chess or whatever, and the reality is they're not. They can't think 5 steps ahead.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, pragmatism denies the ability to think 5 steps ahead, right? I mean. Who knows what'll work and what won't work, but altruism is what ultimately drives all of this, both it's why it works on voters, and it's why it's a moral necessity for the leaders themselves. And it works in 2 ways. One is the need of the Palestinians, but it's also the fact that you have to stand up to Israel because Israel is strong and Israel is successful. So you have to hate them to some extent. You have to at least because they're suffering people all over the world. We're not dropping aid. Right now, there's massive slaughter going on in Sudan. I mean, Christians and the people of the wrong tribe are dying by the thousands in Sudan. Is anybody dropping aid in Sudan? No, because neither party there is worthy of our hate. Here, there's somebody worthy of our hate, which is Israel, because they're strong and powerful. And Muslims can kill Muslims, but primitives can kill primitives, barbarians can kill barbarians. But God forbid a Western country actually stand up to defend itself. All right, Jennifer says, I see this a lot where people think they must love a family member. It seems it's really hard for some people to not be tribal where relatives are concerned, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's absolutely right. Go ahead.
Yeah. It can, I just to add a clarification. I think it can be tribal, and a lot of families are that way. I think another feature of it could be, or it's not either or, it could be both, is that one of the lessons people are taught growing up is that there are certain shoulds in life, there's certain duties you have, and respect your elders, and You have to love everybody, right? And love your enemy, love everybody. That's just a very common view. And so what if this person is a jerk? What if they're an SOB? And well, okay, they're family. And that in effect is the answer to everything. You've got to obey tradition, obey and so it can interact with collectivism. But I think there's that deep, don't trust your judgment. Don't go by what you think about. And that's sort of the deeper sense in which altruism activates that. And then there's the obedience aspect of it too. So there's
You're
a lot of
supposed to love your family, and it's just a given.
Yeah.
Daniel says, your book was illuminating and lucidly written. Any others you're working on?
If he's referring to what justice demands, I really appreciate the compliment.
So.
Everyone's listening. If you really want to hear more about this issue, we'll talk about it next week when we do the debate. But if you want to hear more, you can listen to the book or read it. I just want to make sure I want to plug the book just to be shameless.
Yeah, say something about what the book's about.
Yeah, so the book is an analysis of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What drives it, what keeps it going, and how to solve it. And it's from a unique perspective. It's what I take as the framework for the book is the ideas and values that you get from Ayn Rand, the philosophy of objectivism. It's in the background, but it colors the way the book unpacks the conflict. So we've been talking about this idea of tribalism, collectivism. The book is an individualist, secular, pro-reason perspective on this conflict. And that comes out in the analysis of Israel and what are its virtues, what are its flaws, and it comes out in the analysis of the Palestinian movement and how to think about that enterprise. The book argues, as I think it would not be surprising from today's conversation, that what America should be supportive of Israel hasn't been sufficiently supportive over time. And the reason to do it is insofar as Israel lives up to the ideals of freedom. And I think it does to a significant degree. And that's the principle at play here. So that's a snapshot of the argument. I've heard really encouraging things from people who've read the book lately. It had a spike in interest since October 7th. That's not be surprising.
Good.
And I have mixed feelings because that's not the occasion in which I hoped the book would find an audience, but I'm glad it did in the end. So thank you, Daniel, for that. I'm gratified that you found value in the book. Am I working on other projects? I'm interested. I don't want to talk too much about it. I'm interested in a number of issues. One of them is the development of the American right, and we talked a bit about that today. So how did it get to where it is now? And I'm also interested in, it could be the same project, but just the cultural abandonment of individualism. The fact that people don't know what it is, that what they're drifting toward is tribalism. I think there's a lot there, but it's still early days.
Let's see. Alejandro says, it's been 20 years since the Madrid 11th March attacks. Any thoughts?
So for people who don't remember what those were, this was an attack, a sophisticated bomb attack on the train system in Madrid at rush hour on a weekday, and pretty lethal. And this was in 2004 on the eve of an election in Spain. And I think the way this was processed at the time is that this pushed Spain towards a different election outcome. So this was seen as really significant. And who carried out the attacks? This was an Islamist attack, from what I remember. And this was early in the 2000s, right? 2004. I think a couple of thoughts on this. So it was a precursor to what happened in London in 2005, the bombing on the London Underground and the buses. And then it led to, I think it encouraged further attacks that we saw play out in the years that followed. So I think it was a sign that there was a community of people in Europe who found the idea of Islamic totalitarianism not just interesting, but worth dying for. and that was revealed continually. And that was, we talked about this a lot at the time. The signals are there. They have to take this seriously. And one of the things we've talked about, and this is the subject of other books I've written, one of them is failing to confront Islamic totalitarianism, what went wrong after 9/11. One of the themes in that work is the failure to understand the nature of this enemy, the failure to defeat it, leads to things exactly like this. So notice this happened a year after the Iraq invasion. Iraq, this is one of the things you were really vocal about, Yaron. Iraq was not the right target. It was completely the wrong target. And I think it showed a weakness on the part of the West, and part of the US as well, that I think emboldened the Islamists to feel like, yeah, they don't know what they're doing. Of course not. And they let us go in Afghanistan. So this is also 2 years after the Afghanistan debacle. So America goes into Afghanistan and lets the Taliban, through its fingers, escape into Pakistan. And there's a whole history about how Osama bin Laden was a free man for basically 10 years after 9/11. So there's a lot to say there. I think it was a watershed moment, if we want to look at that Madrid attack in many ways.
And we kind of have learned nothing from it. I mean, we're still struggling with the same Islamists globally. And what was interesting politically is it caused the relatively, I guess, center-right government of Jose Maria Aznar, who was doing good things in Spain, who were reforming the economy and doing a lot of good things, but who had supported the US invasion of Iraq. It caused them to lose the election. The idea was, it's because of your support for Iraq the bombings happened. The way to stop bombings like this from happening in the future is by appeasing the terrorists. So we need, Spain elected the Socialist Party, and Socialist Party undid a lot of the good things Aznar's government had done. And so we didn't learn how to deal with the terrorists. And in the end, Spain itself suffered because they got a socialist government in its place. What was interesting at the time was, this is a lesson for social media, is the immediate response after the bombing was, it must be the Basques.
Mm-hmm.
And there were huge rallies in Spain over this idea that it's the Basques, and showing unity of Spain and everything. And then as the day wore on, it became clear that it was Islamists, and the whole atmosphere in Spain changed. So it was really, it was, as you said, a watershed event in the history of Spain, and a strong illustration of how we don't know what we're doing in the war with the Islamists. All right, Laned Dissenter, something like that. Yaron and Elan, debate partners when? When we find somebody who will match us up with somebody. I mean, the problem is finding the other side. It would have been, yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which I'm glad I didn't get to do the Lex debate, because Finkelstein is such a scumbag. I don't really want to be on the same stage with him.
I haven't done many debates. I've done one real debate, and I didn't think I did very well. I didn't like it, and one of the takeaways for me was, I'm not convinced it's a great way to get to people. So, and what the other takeaway I had after the debate was, I'm glad the guy I debated was the guy I debated and not somebody worse, because then I would have been in the really uncomfortable position of, I'm on a stage with someone I don't respect. I don't really want to be in that position. And I think the Finkelstein, I'm glad I agree with you. I don't think I would want to be across the table from Finkelstein or somebody his kind. And
no, he's
unfortunately,
particularly bad. Yeah,
there's just way too many people in this topic that I don't know. I don't see a reason to debate them.
Yeah, as you know, I've done dozens of debates. Some people have converted to objectivism because of my debates. So
that speaks to your strength more than anything.
What's that?
I said that speaks to your strength, not the debate format.
Maybe. Well, debate format it brings people to the event that wouldn't come otherwise.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, debates are useless in terms of actual delving and discussing intellectual ideas. But a lot of people like them, so they show up. So you get exposed to a larger audience.
But thanks for the vote of confidence from the questioner. Appreciate
Yeah,
that.
no, it would be fun to do a debate with Elan, not against Elan, with Elan. All right, Mary Aline says Murray seems to understand. I assume this is Douglas Murray. Seems to understand that Israel must clearly win and Hamas must lose. Yet overall, he's an altruist. He's an altruist. Thoughts or comments?
I think Douglas Murray has been particularly good on this issue,
Yeah.
and I've been impressed with him. I have concerns about Douglas Murray from a few years back, and I recently read his book, The War in the West, and it confirmed my concerns because I think he's a sophisticated conservative. I think he's quite really smart, and I respect that about him. The last part of the book really alarmed me, and that the last part of the book is the book is about the attacks on the West, which he's good at illustrating some of the problems that are being faced right now, and particularly from the progressive, woke, tribal side of things. What he says at the end, and it goes to the question of, I think the question is asking, is he an altruist? Is there a sort of an Achilles heel here? And I think there is, and the concern I have is not only is there this altruism, but based on what I read in his book, one concern is that he walks this line of, we're for the West, it has Enlightenment values, and it's about, it happened in Europe, and a lot of people, they're Europeans, and it's not quite racial, and I don't think he's a racist, but it's very close to that line. And he even says in the book, which is really interesting to read it, it's, look, you make me, it's like a monologue to his opponent, like, you're pushing me to identify as a white person. I don't want to do that. But if you push me, I'm going to do it. And I'm not capturing it exactly, but I was uncomfortable with that. And I think that is an Achilles heel. If your debating strategy with opponents just is, okay, you set the terms, I'm going to push back from this perspective, I don't know. And so to think about this context broadly, it's a question. I would love to talk with him more about that, and just to see what is this like a tactic for you, or is this more like you actually think this? And where do you draw the line? Is it really about, it happened in Europe, so it's essentially European/national? Is there sort of ethnic element?
He doesn't think it's in the genes, but he thinks there's something about being European that's unique, and that, so I don't think he would say, oh, this couldn't have happened somewhere else, right? I don't think genetically, from a genetic perspective, but he thinks there's something unique, and that it's so hard for people outside of Europe to assimilate to that, to accept that it's better just to keep them out. And he walks a very fine line. I've done a couple of panels with him, and yeah, the things he says that are so close to being, and I don't think he's a racist, but I think there's things that come very close to that, where he sanctions a racist perspective even without knowing it. But he's super smart. He's super articulate. I love his accent. How can you not love his accent? He also grants way too much to Christianity, right? He also, I've seen him on talks I saw him do a video with Tom Holland, the guy who wrote Dominion. And Dominion's awful. In many ways, I mean, it's an interesting book, and I don't know if you're familiar with this book, but it's a book about how, well, I mean, everything that's happened in the West is Christian, because Christianity was dominant everywhere in the West when it happened. So even the Enlightenment, even though it ridiculed Christian, that's from within Christianity. That's not from outside. So everything is pro-Christian. On the one hand, he gets that communism and woke are basically Christian, but he can't separate the metaphysics, the epistemology, the morality of Christianity. So he doesn't get that it's the morality of Christianity, the woke and communism grasp. He can't get the Enlightenment. He can't. It's a very strange book, because he's a Greek scholar, and he says things about Greece that are not true. But I saw a thing with him and Douglas Murray. Douglas Murray basically saying, yeah, the West is Christian. Even though I'm not Christian, I'm an atheist. The West is Christian. It just is. We have to accept it and we have to embrace it. But he writes a great column. One of the things I like about him is he has this reverence for culture. And he writes a great column for Free Press, for Barry Weiss's thing, on poetry every, I think, Sunday or something. And they're really beautifully written. And he brings out some beautiful things. You know, some of them are kind of altruistic and sacrificial, but he emphasizes some really beautiful stuff. All right. Frank. Frank asks questions. Sometimes it's hard to... okay. I see Christianity as originally dualistic with Judaism and achieved identity with Catholicism's dichotomy, and then evolved to compete with Protestantism. Any offhand thoughts as a philosophical progression? I'll take a shot at this, Frank. You'll tell me if I'm advancing the question, because it's hard. I mean, Christianity did, I think, evolve as a religion ideology that was contrasted with Judaism. So it was in this competition, if you will, with Judaism. But it did achieve, you're right, it did achieve its own identity at some point and rejected Judaism when it achieved a certain critical mass of people who believed in it. And when it was formalized under Catholic dogma, and that happened anywhere between 300 and, I don't know, 1,000, it slowly kind of solidified as Christian dogma. But the Christian dogma, of course, is false, and it's dogma, and it doesn't lead to anything really good. So it inevitably, I think, ultimately broke apart. And that's the rise of the whole Protestant movement, which is the breaking apart of Catholicism without yet rejecting Christianity completely. And yes, then Catholicism has to compete with Protestantism. But that's the beauty of the Enlightenment. The fragmentation of Christianity created space in which the real rebels, the Enlightenment, could arise. The Renaissance and the Enlightenment could arise. So I think all that happens, you know, whether that's philosophically inevitable that it happens in that sequence, I doubt. I don't think that's true. I just think that happens to have happened in history. I don't think it's inevitable or philosophically inevitable. All right, Eric, did you see the documentary of Clarence Thomas? He stated it was the fountainhead that motivated him to compromise and not stay in a mediocre job. Oh, not to compromise, to not compromise. I haven't, but I know that story. That is, Clarence Thomas is a huge Fountainhead fan. He has his clerks, his law clerks. Every year they get together and watch the Fountainhead together. He and the clerks watch it together at I guess at his home or something. So he makes a big deal out of the Fountainhead. He's very intellectual. Clarence Thomas is very intellectual. You can tell that in his rulings. And he's very good on some things, and he's very confused on other things. And he still harbors religion, and he can't let go of religion. So, but there's no question Ayn Rand had a huge influence on him. And there's this, I mean, it's a good indication of the fact that Ayn Rand had a huge influence on lots of people, really lots of people, and in ways that we don't appreciate, really don't appreciate, because we don't know the impact. You know, who knew that Atlas Shrugged was Steve Jobs' favorite book, or that you know, that almost everybody in Silicon Valley in the early days of Silicon Valley was an Ayn Rand fan, or that certain politicians were Ayn Rand fans, and certain it just, her influence is far, far greater than I think most people think. And we still need the historians to go in and do the kind of digging and work about Ayn Rand's influence on the culture. I think there'll be a lot of surprises when they do.
Just one thought on that, Yaron.
Yeah.
I think it's, if anyone saw the Joe Rogan interview with Zack Snyder, that came up. Zack Snyder wants to do a series. Netflix turned him down. I did a podcast on that. one of the things that interested me about that exchange is this issue of influence, which is they go back and forth. Oh, Steve Jobs was interested in Ayn Rand, and then that really surprises Joe Rogan. Oh,
Oh, yeah.
Steve Jobs. Oh, no, I respect Steve Jobs. How does this integrate? I don't know. How does this? Because the way I think of Ayn Rand's influence. So I think there's two aspects to this. One, the view of Ayn Rand in the culture and what her influence has been is really shallow.
Yep.
Like you can see that because they can't understand what it is. And then I think there's a view among some of her fans about what influence looks like that is also shallow, in the sense that, oh, they read so-and-so is a fan of the book, but look at all the ways they're not like Ayn Rand's philosophy. They don't live up to her philosophy. And I think the important point I would stress is influence is a really broad phenomenon. It's way broader than, so Yaron, you were influenced by Ayn Rand. It defines your career. It defines you in such a fundamental way. But Steve Jobs was influenced by Ayn Rand, and both are true. And it didn't define his career in the same way, but it did something to him that it was indelible, right?
Question.
The way to conceptualize it takes a lot more work than I think people realize. Because I have to say, I've been influenced by other thinkers, but not in the way that I've been influenced by Ayn Rand. But it doesn't make it any less real that I read their work. It left an impact. And so I think I agree, there's sort of historical work to do, but there's also work to do to appreciate the variation and the subtleties of what influence looks like. Because I'll tell you one example that is really fresh for me. The Davos speech that Millet gave.
Yep.
I watched that and I came away thinking, if I didn't know he had read Atlas Shrugged, I would be convinced that he had read Atlas Shrugged, because the way he's describing business people and the whole moral tone to it. Now, I don't know who wrote the speech, but it so clearly has echoes of Atlas Shrugged. Now, that takes, I don't think someone watching that who doesn't have a context in Ayn Rand's work would recognize it. But that to me is, yeah, that's another example that is easy to overlook or to dismiss as not significant. But it is significant. I mean, he's the head of Argentina.
It's hugely significant. And of course, the other thing is that people, particularly her fans, think that the influence will come in politics.
Mm-hmm.
And so they say, but look, the culture, politically we're deteriorating. And the reality is that she's had a massive influence for 50, 60, 70 years. But it hasn't manifested in politics. Although even the politics are probably better than they would otherwise be without her. But it's manifested itself in Silicon Valley, in our standard of living, quality of life, and inspiring business people to go into business and create and produce. And I don't think people appreciate that, because it's almost like the only dimension they can think of is a political dimension. It's the only area in which influence matters to people. All right, we're already 2 hours in, so we've got a few more questions. We'll try to get through these quickly. All right, so these are all over the place. Let's see. John is asking, brainwashing by subliminal messages is an attempt to get people to vote a certain way. Is this only achieved if the victim's values aren't made explicit to themselves? Isn't it just subconscious exploitation of non-thinkers? I'm not even sure it's a thing. I'm not even sure if there is such a thing as subliminal messages, right? I know it's attempted in marketing and everything else, but I don't know. I don't think it's a real thing. And you're absolutely right to the extent that it is, and maybe it's not so subliminal. It only works with unthinking people, because it's like, when I first came to America, one of the things that really stunned me were the beer commercials, right? There were all these beer commercials. They all looked exactly the same. Bikini-clad women, really good-looking women drinking beer on yachts and cars, all over the place. That was the thing. And that was supposed to get you to drink beer. And it was like, I don't get it. I mean, I get beautiful women. That I get. I don't get beer, right? And there's nothing about these commercials that causes me even a tiny little bit to want to drink beer. But it must work on somebody, otherwise they wouldn't spend the gazillions of dollars. So who does it work on? Somebody who have very, very different values than me, and people who I think don't think for themselves or don't have a conception of what life actually can be. Yeah, I mean, beer commercials always intrigued me. I don't get them. Yeah, of course, that's become politically incorrect, so they don't have bikini-clad women in beer commercials anymore, but not for any reason other than it's not politically correct. All right, Dave, Aristotle stated that the most enduring friendships are founded on moral virtue alignment. Are consistent pragmatists morally ineligible to be good friends with consistent objectivists?
What is a consistent pragmatist?
Yeah, I'm not sure what a consistent pragmatist means.
Yeah,
That's
I don't
right.
know.
I think that's a contradiction in terms. I think the answer is yes. Do you really want to be a friend with somebody who is a real pragmatist, who doesn't believe in the long term, doesn't believe in principles? That's a scary proposition to be close to somebody like that in any kind of realm. So yeah, stay away from people who don't have values and are really willing to live by those values in a consistent way. And good values, right?
Another thing, sorry, just one other thought
Yeah.
there. I think the way the questioner put it is that sort of the deepest friendships, and Aristotle has an interesting view on friendship, which is that it comes in different kinds, and this is the deepest kind. There are other kinds, and
Yep.
it's good to think about what that looks like in your own life, so that not everyone you are friends with is your most deepest friend, best friend, or whatever. There are different friendships, different levels of friendships, and I'm not going to I'm not going to defend people who are pragmatists, because I think it's a bad way to live. But there might be a delimited relationship you have with someone who has that tendency, but you have to know that and recognize that it's going to be a limit on the depth of the values you could have in common. Because the important thing to know about people is that I was making, what I said was somewhat flippant. Is there a consistent pragmatist? But the reality is that people, just as there's a mixed economy of the soul, and people have really bad elements of them and really good elements. And you have to think, and not everybody, but people come in such varieties. You have to really think about what aspects of their character is good and what's not, and what to support and what not. And that it's really, it takes work to think through. So I encourage that whoever asked the question, is invest the right amount of thought in the kind of friendships and relationships you want, and recognize that people, even if they do one pragmatist thing, that does not mean that, it might mean that they're like that all the way through, but recognize, if they're going to just be your tennis partner, that's one thing. You just know what the risks are.
Yeah, I think that's why I use consistent pragmatists to get away from the somewhat pragmatists sometimes, right?
Okay.
Versus the pragmatic pragmatists. All right. What should be done about North Korea? Do the people have any concept of Western ideas so they can fight back, or are they brainwashed forever?
I mean, the last time I did serious work on North Korea was like 15 years ago, so my knowledge is not up to date. What I'll say is that my understanding of the culture of North Korea is that it's purposely made ignorant, as you would expect in a dictatorship, but to a scale that you would be dumbfounded if you understood. So I read about this recently, last couple of years. I think there's a question of how much outside knowledge has managed to seep in. There have been campaigns for decades to smuggle thumb drives and smartphones, and so people can get information from the outside world. But this is really a hermetically sealed country that has just a few entry points. So I don't think the influence of the West is very strong or strong enough. What could be done about North Korea? That's a really big issue. And I think it starts with understanding how everything that was done for the last 30 years has just made things worse, which is a policy of appeasement. It started basically under Clinton and was continued as a bipartisan policy all the way through to the North Koreans going nuclear. And they did it thanks to this policy, not despite this policy.
And it was continued with Trump.
Oh, well, Trump gave a bear hug to North Korea. So,
all right, pickaxing on Europa for both. Do you think Lex Friedman managed the Israel-Palestinian debate yesterday well? Discord friends thought Finkelstein nailed it, sadly. Thoughts. We're going to defer that to next Thursday, where we're going to go in depth into the debate, including Lex Friedman's, how he managed it, and who he thought won. But we will, we'll analyze it. Maybe we'll give some of our own answers to some of the questions that were asked. I still have to think about how we want to kind of organize our discussion around it, because it is a 5-hour debate. We can't answer everything. We can't, but we'll figure that out by Thursday. So Thursday will be the big show on that debate. Justin says, why did the Nazis embrace evolution when they were anti-reason? Because it served their purposes, because they used it to develop a theory of eugenics, which served their purposes. And a lot of Christians embrace evolution. A lot of people embrace evolution who are anti-reason. The fact that you embrace one field in science doesn't make you pro-reason. Let's see, Apollo Zeus, your view on the Manchester Arena attack. I mean, I'm not sure what view we could have. It was horrific. Right?
Yeah. I mean, it was particularly horrific because if I remember correctly, this was the Ariana Grande concert. And so the people in the audience were mostly teenage girls with their moms, maybe, and maybe some of their friends. So it was a particularly heinous attack. I mean, it's difficult to answer that question without more specificity, because at that point there's the Manchester attack, there's the Tower Bridge attack, there's the attacks in Paris. What is it that you want to distinguish about them and evaluate? They're all coming from the same kind of ideology that was unmet with any serious resistance.
Yep. It just shows you that I have no idea who Ariana whatever is, who that person is. Ariana Grande, no idea. All right, Michael, sorry joining late. The Atlantic's April issue has a good article on American Jews facing hatred from left, privilege, and right conspiracies. Any comments if I read it? I haven't read it yet. Have you read this?
It's on my queue to read this week, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there'll be anything new. We know this, that on both sides, I mean, the conspiracies are just, they're nonstop, and they're all the same old conspiracies of the Jews controlling the world one way or the other. And it's stunning how kind of the protocols of the elders of Zion, in a sense, gets recycled year after year after year in different forms, in different ways, but all basically the same idea. A pamphlet developed by Russian propagandists to justify pogroms is now really everywhere in the world and being used extensively. The arguments, they were used extensively. Let's see, Pickaxe, a former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice wrote Democracy Stories from the Long Road to Freedom and argued U.S. for staying in Afghanistan and broader U.S. Western occupation. I enjoy Rice. Your thoughts about her?
Not a fan. Condoleezza Rice was one of the, I don't know if her view was completely aligned, but when Bush was in power and she was his Secretary of State, I believe, she went around the Middle East saying, you got to have an election. You got to have an election. So she went around pushing the idea of the forward strategy of freedom. And it didn't take very long to realize, as we were arguing from the beginning, this is a catastrophic policy. You're going to empower your enemies at every step, or give them greater power than they already have, if not completely put them in political office. And one of the things she said about that policy, and then one of the things she said about Israel, have always haunted me. About the forward strategy of freedom in Lebanon, when the elections happened, Hezbollah, the Islamist group that Iran supports, had a huge showing. They basically got incredible power in the country. And she was asked about this, Condoleezza Rice, what do you think about Islamists coming up in Lebanon as well as other places? And her answer was, these are the birth pangs of a new Middle East. Okay,
Oh,
well,
God.
that is a gargantuan evasion of what's happening. And then soon after this, so you have to remember that, as you've probably talked about in the show, at the same time, one of the places where they're having elections, pushed by the US, I think you've talked about this,
Yep.
is Gaza, which was the Palestinian territories, including Gaza. And that's what led to Hamas coming to power. But right before the elections was the Israel withdrawal, 2005. And what did she say about that? And that's really the thing that I remember vividly. So Israel withdrew unilaterally. It wasn't a land for peace. It was just land. Take the land. We don't, you have at it, basically. No quid pro quo, contrary to the basic formula of all the peace process that had come before that. And Condoleezza Rice said, it cannot be only Gaza. Okay, that, as they say now, hasn't aged well, because it didn't age well the moment after she said it. It was just so catastrophically irrational that within a year, a year and a half, Hamas was in power. Then they were shooting rockets, and here we are after October 7th. And this was a direct result. And imagine if Israel had said, yeah, you know what, let's now keep going. Let's keep withdrawing unilaterally from the rest of these places. See what happens then. Yeah, we can tell you what would happen.
Yeah, I mean, it was also America that forced Israel to allow Hamas to participate in those elections. Israel didn't want them because they didn't want somebody who, in their charter, denies the existence of Israel and calls for the annihilation of Israel to be part of those elections for the Palestinian government. And it was Condoleezza Rice and the Bush administration that forced Israel to let them participate. And they won. They won, just like Hezbollah won in Lebanon. All right, Fender Hopper says, great interview, Elan. I love your episodes of New Idea Live. And Daniel Duffy, do you think Iran will get a nuke or will Israel stop them?
I can tell you what I hope happens, and that I hope that Israel isn't too distracted by Gaza to take action to prevent Iran from getting a weapon. I think that the evidence that Israel is trying to do that is significant. We know it was about 10 years ago, they were part of the Stuxnet worm, and there's other sort of subterfuge that they did to the parts that Iran is buying. And it's not, I think it's part of their strategy, and it might not look like what they did to Iraq in 1981. It might be more in the background, but I really think they need to do that because there's no telling what Iran will do. Will they succeed? I don't know. I can't answer that question.
Paulo just says, I'm no fool, but I am not convinced. Tommy Robinson is a far-right monster and is an ally in the Western fight against Islamism. I could be wrong, your opinion. So I guess your opinion on Tommy Robinson.
I mean, I read a bit about him when he got some notoriety, but I don't have a definite view.
Yeah, I don't particularly either. I suspect he's more of a, I suspect he's not very sophisticated or very either way. So whether he's a tool of others or whether he's a real monster or whether he's really against these, but I don't think he's an ally to any of us. I don't think he's working for the same cause we are. All right. Almost
Great.
2.5 hours. Cool.
All right.
As I mentioned earlier, Elan will be back on Thursday, 7 p.m. East Coast time next week to talk about the debate, the Lex Friedman debate. We will reconvene then. I will see you guys. We have a show tomorrow, 3 p.m. No, well, I don't know actually because clock has moved. I don't know, either 2 or 3 p.m. East Coast time. I'll decide tomorrow. I'll let you know. One of those 2 hours. And thank you, Elan.
It's my pleasure. It's great talking to you, Ron. I'll see you next time.
Yep. See you next time. Thanks, guys. See you all tomorrow. Have a great rest of your evening. Quick questions just came in. Is Western aid to Africa helpful or not? Seems like they are turning their back on us. I don't think it's really helpful.
As a principle, I'm against foreign aid. I don't think it accomplishes what it's supposed to, and it's just inherently sacrificial. I only support it in the delimited context where you already are committed to doing it. And if you're going to do that, you you're better off supporting people who are friendly to you than you are your enemies. So, but as a principle, I don't think it has any part in a free government's policy.
Absolutely. It's kind of a welfare, and it's not good for you, and it's not good for the people receiving it. It creates distortions on both sides. All right, everybody.
Right.
See
Till
you
next time.
tomorrow. Bye, Elan.